Praetorian here. Your representation sucks. Let's talk a bit about one of the largest reasons why. I started talking about this more publicly again because I see a lot of ostensibly like-minded people. Like-minded people with intentions to protect and preserve. But I notice that there's always been an issue of defining what it is that unifies any one group. And that's exactly where revolutions, peaceful or otherwise, always hinge, defining the end result. As such, while the pathos may overlap with so many others, I don't wish to only add another drop to the bucket, saying the same things in the same echo chambers. Instead, I want to provide a bit of a political and philosophical reality to these conversations. I'd like to point out that, like operations, political movements must have a certain unity of understanding and practical functional direction. And like operations, leaving understanding and direction to ad hoc circumstance, action without a plan, leads to discord and confusion at inopportune places and times. The American Revolution was so successful, and remains rather unique in its success, because it was not based on purely reactionary action, moment to moment. It wasn't driven by the hunger of the populace or the failure of an imperial war. It had real leadership, whose ideas had been birthed in 2,000 years of political history and nurtured in their service of the empire from which they declared independence. The specificity of the declaration permitted the longevity of the idea. The conviction behind the declaration permitted a show of strength and unity. So let's be specific in our declarations. Let's go beyond no taxation without representation. All collapse creates a power vacuum. Largely in the name of individualism, actual political mechanisms are little discussed in the context of recovering from a collapse of the magnitude many might infer to be coming. Fewer still speak of the specifics of the potential to actually recover liberty and the republic from the brink upon which it has been sitting. Ron Paul seems to have started something around the 2008 presidential campaign, which has since been followed on by organizations like the TenthAmendmentCenter, and made even into political action by the Mises Caucus of the previously laughable Libertarian Party. But more is needed. More recognition of the major obstacles. One of these major obstacles is the Reapportionment Act of 1911. Note that year, as it will come up again in future issues. As an early practical step to restoration of Republican government, with a lowercase r, addressing this act can go a long way. So what does this act do? It was passed in Congress on the 8th of August, 1911. The act is responsible for setting the number of seats in Congress to then 433, with 2 more made available for the states which joined the Union the following year, 1912, for a total number of 435 congressional representatives. These seats were apportioned based on the 1910 census and stems from Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which states in part, quote, "Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states, according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed." It goes on to say, quote, "The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such a manner as they shall direct by law. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative." So the Constitution prescribes a maximum of 1 representative for every 30,000 persons, as enumerated by a census. It gives no guidelines in the other direction. There's no correlated minimum. That's left up to the people. The apportionment is intended to be updated every 10 years as a result of the censuses taken in the meantime. So let's take a look at 1910. From historical documents, the entire population of the United States relevant to apportionment of representation can be seen in the Table 12, shown as 91,972,266 people. In the 1911 Reapportionment Act, this resulted in 433 representatives, plus 2 set aside for the upcoming new states. The breakdown per state is seen in the same document in Table 15 shown here. The discussion within the document around the table goes on to point out that, quote, "It is obvious from the table above that the representation of the states is not exactly proportional to their population," end quote. And that's due to the fact that the population of no state is exactly divisible by the ratio of representation and that each is guaranteed a minimum of 1 representative. Okay. Setting aside that hand-waving, let's take a look at the aggregate. Almost 92 million people with 435 representatives yields a ratio of 213,729 people per representative. Referring back to Table 15, we can see, for example, that the state of Alabama is almost exactly the national aggregate average of representation. Just for fun, we can see from Table 12 before that Nevada and Wyoming, due to the minimum provision of 1 rep, are technically overrepresented in Congress as they fall below the national aggregate average. Arizona was not yet a state, but would be added to that list the following year, so Arizona, Nevada, and Wyoming. Now let's take a look at today, even though the point should now be obvious. The U.S. Census Bureau, note that this is no longer a function of the states. The Census Bureau lists the current United States population as approximately 334,315,977 people. But we still have 435 congressional representatives. That means that our new ratio of representation is no longer 213,001, but rather 768,542 people per member of Congress. Again, for a fun metric, Wyoming, again, Vermont, and Washington, D.C., although it shouldn't count, all fall under the aggregate national average. In case it wasn't obvious, let me ask the question. Do you feel that you could adequately represent 750,000 people and their interests? Do you feel that you could have adequately represented almost 250,000 people? I don't. This has made it horribly difficult to perform the job of a representative, that is, especially as government scope keeps creeping into increasingly detailed domestic issues. How can we expect even the best individuals that we have available to perform in this position without untenable compromises? Realistically, we can't. They have to compromise something. But let's take it a bit further. As I said before in the video on term limits, men died for the foundation of the United States. They lost their fortunes and their lives. So let's take a look at them in the same context. At a time at which no taxation without representation became a rallying cry to armed conflict. On August 2nd, 1790, the first U.S. Census was started, allowing 9 months to complete it. The aggregate result for the then 13 states was 3,929,214 people. This census resulted in 105 members of Congress, up from 65 in 1787, for an aggregate average of 37,421 people per United States representative in Congress assembled. I don't think much comment's necessary in comparison of these figures. But let's look at one more thing. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. In that year, based on historical documentation, it appears that the population of the former 13 colonies was around 2.5 million people. But what about even before that? An analysis of several sources available from the current Census Bureau documents estimates of the population for various years, mostly colonial, and presents the following. I'll note here on these figures that the numbers for Bancroft do include slaves, so Dexter's likely do as well, resulting in a 1760 population of about 1.7 million people and a 1767 population of about 2 million people. So where am I going with this? Isaac Barr, William Pitt the Elder, and Edmund Burke, who is known for statements such as, quote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing," All of these men sided with the colony's resistance to taxation in the face of a lack of direct representation in the British Parliament. At least 3 men in the Parliament spoke up for the colonies and even voted against things like the Stamp Act. Their principle was met with the idea that the colonies had, quote, virtual representation, and their points were moot. So a bit more than a decade later, when the British military was on its way to seize powder and arms, the shot heard around the world was fired, precipitating a world-changing revolution. A population of around 2 million people, with at least 3 effectual defenders in Parliament, ended up in a shooting war for lack of representation. That's about 2/3 of a million people per representative voice. We currently have a more dilute representation of 3/4 of a million people to 1 representative. This evil, for that is what it is, was made permanent in the Apportionment Act of 1929. Again, note the year for the future. With William Bankhead, a Democrat representative from Alabama, describing it as, quote, the abdication and surrender of the vital fundamental powers vested in the Congress of the United States by the Constitution itself, end quote. I'd say that's apt. Oh, and the part about revisiting it every 10 years per the Constitution, the Reapportionment Act of 1941, yeah, they were revisiting it every 10 years up until this point, eliminated this revisitation in direct violation of the letter of the Constitution. Some legal argument would probably attempt to be made for its benefits, or at least for its relative constitutionality, on grounds that Congress was doing so in such a manner as they shall by law direct. But the Constitution isn't constructed in a way that would allow Congress to violate stipulations allocated to Congress, explicit limitations and powers expressly directed toward Congress. So they're violating the letter of the Constitution when they ignore the 10-year revisitation of this reapportionment. This is how these things happen. First, it's questionable. Then it's normalized and simply violates the spirit of the origin. Finally, it grows bold enough to violate the letter of the law in plain day. As Edmund Burke also said, the greater the power, the more dangerous the abuse. And when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. Remember, there is no liberty without virtue, and we are the Praetorians of the Republic.